welcome back to another episode of the DDGeopolitics podcast. I am Sarah, once again joined by Yara, and today our guest is Wyatt Reed, managing editor at the Grayzone independent news outlet, recent author of an article debunking a bunch of IDF claims as well as the hypocrisy within the United States government. Wyatt, hi, how are you today? How was your weekend?
I'm all right. It was just fine. Appreciate you guys for having me on. It's always good to be here with you guys.
And Yara, welcome back from your day off that was unauthorized.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time, Dee.
Always, always, always. And while we have all of you guys here, please like, share, and subscribe the stream because we are obviously deboosted for various reasons. So Wyatt, today we want to talk about the bombardment of misinformation, disinformation, lies. I'm not really sure what we're propaganda, black propaganda, maybe all of the above. Maybe we can try to unravel these sort of webs that the IDF has spun. I know that Yara and I have kind of tried to keep up with it, but even with our own due diligence, I've lost a lot of the timeline because every day it's like another like avalanche of information. So what we were with the Nova Festival. So, and you guys chime in when I miss something. So we know that it was 7 October. It was initially supposed to be Thursday and Friday. About a month ago, well, initially the casualty count was 260. Then it kind of yo-yoed, and now we're back at 364. About a month ago, a video surfaced about with an Apache helicopter, and I think Area is going to pull it up, and it's been released for over a month. I'm not sure why. Like recently, it was kind of like, oh, breaking news. But what we can see here, and our audience hopefully sees, is that we don't really know, but it does look like some indiscriminate fire from a IDF Apache helicopter. So we've been told that this was like an all-out assault by Hamas, and now we've been finding out that IDF has been responsible for a lot of the casualties. So what are your guys' thoughts on the Apache helicopter video?
You're right. That video has been out for several weeks. We first reported on that at the Grayzone back in October, if I'm not mistaken. But you can tell just, on the face, they're blowing up cars. They're blowing up vehicles, right? Like Hamas, they flew in on these bizarre paraglider contraptions. They weren't driving in SUVs, right? So and as far as I'm aware, there's never been an assertion by the IDF or by the Israelis in general that Hamas was, driving around in SUVs, that they apparently crossed the border in these now. I mean, so it was always absurd on its face, and that was why, to me, even kind of shocking that they released this at all, that they let this footage get out there in the first place, because it is so damning. You can see people are clearly fleeing for their lives, right? It's not some kind of counter-offensive or offensives, I should say, being launched. It's very clearly just people running out of their cars as they are blown up. I'm also not sure if there have even been claims from the Israeli side that the Hamas militants which were operating in this area were using anything other than guns, right? Light sort of caliber weaponry, things that could not have caused that kind of damage. These huge explosions that, clearly incinerated cars. I don't think they were wandering around, wasting their RPGs on civilian cars like that. There's no indication, as far as I'm aware, even accusations from the Israeli side that they did. So there's always this huge disconnect between the Israeli narrative and between the actual footage and evidence coming out on the ground. And that gap has not narrowed at all. In fact, if anything, it seems to be getting wider. We have this daily deluge of more videos, more supposed proof from the Israeli forces. It changes constantly. First, they said, of course, that they had to ethnically cleanse North Gaza. They had to force out all of its inhabitants at gunpoint at the point of mass bombing campaigns. And the justification or excuse for all of this was, of course, that North Gaza was a hotbed of Hamas activity, that hospitals like Al-Shifa, most famously, obviously, were the command center of some kind of Hamas operation. Those, of course, turned out to be complete BS. There has been no evidence provided, except today we finally saw the first sort of video of something that might actually be a tunnel. Previously, we were shown video of an elevator shaft. In the recent IDF propaganda video, where the Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus of the IDF basically gives a guided tour to a handful of credulous media. People like Fox News' Trey Yingst managed to unwittingly document
Wyatt, you're gonna do
change of evidence.
You're gonna do the whole episode. The first question, because we haven't even there's still another 20 lies about the festival. So the
festival. Okay. I mean, the list of lies is long and it grows longer every day. So we'll start wherever you want.
I'm trying to understand I think we're all trying to understand what happened that day. And, and exactly when that was going to be a lot of my questions today, when you said, why even release it? Why even release the video of the helicopter? Was that to try to say, oh, we're trying to be transparent, and then swiftly realizing that you're wait, maybe we shouldn't have. Why even bother releasing it at all? I think that they would be better off, being more like the Russians or even the Americans who are you don't need to see that. That's not for you to see.
Well, I mean, again, their whole international support is contingent on waging this public relations campaign. So I think they do feel some level of pressure to get out anything. And I think that's also what you saw with the same video. I know you don't want to get too far ahead of it, but the same video I'm talking about in Al-Shifa, where they go discover first it was one AK-47 behind the MRI machine. Then it turned later into two AK-47s in the same Hamas go bag. But in these same videos, we saw footage of a laptop ostensibly belonging to some kind of Hamas terrorist that was logged in and open, and had a photo of one of the IDF soldiers who was taken captive on October 7th displayed on the screen. It was apparently not password protected or was belonging to somebody on the IDF, right? More likely the latter. The big question is, how could you let that happen? That's such a massive F up that how could you let that happen? And yet they did, right? They did, and then they deleted the video. They reposted it with the image blurred. But I mean, it's so much of the Israeli mystique and kind of the prestige that's been put out there in terms of the military aspect, the technological aspect, and of course the propaganda aspect. I think we're starting to see a lot of these are kind of paper tigers, and a stiff breeze or a stiff bit of resistance from Palestinian militants seems to be enough to blow the whole facade over.
Well, in the spirit of throwing things at the wall and just trying to get something to stick, why have we they've contradicted themselves? So we've first we're told that nobody knew about anything. Hamas attacked on the 7th independently. Nobody knew. Israel didn't know either. We're expected to believe that. Then we were told that Egypt actually knew about it and then warned Israel. Then we were told that Hamas actually knew about the festival and had been planning it for 2 years. Then in the recent Haaretz article, which was the same one that they talked about the helicopter actually killing Israelis, the same article. Now I'm losing my train of thought, but now they're saying that Hamas had no clue, couldn't have known, because the festival was scheduled for Thursday, Friday, and then last minute extension into Saturday, and maybe the location changed. We're not really sure about that. So we've gone from Egypt knowing, Hamas knowing, there being a plan, Israel may be letting it happen, and now we're hearing that nobody knew about anything. It was a spur of the moment. Hamas just saw the crowd via drones, and then went. So what? Why?
And Sarah, to add to that real quick, that we know that before October 7th, Israel had been on the brink of a civil war, right? It was spurred by essentially Bibi Netanyahu's plans to change parts of Israeli life and society. So we knew that they were also at that brink. So that comes at a very convenient moment because, you know, the attack itself created an emergency government on Israel's side. So that just means that he can do whatever. Also, a last thing that I was going to mention is quantitatively, just if you look at the deaths, we know that Haaretz posted that mostly the people, and the Israel account actually posted this on their Twitter, the deaths were mostly military personnel as well. So also important to mention.
Right.
So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I know we do know from the video footage, right? We know from this Haaretz article specifically, you know, that wasn't the only finding. We also saw that they pointed out that in one of the body cam videos published by Hamas militant, they can be seen asking these party goers to direct them to the kibbutz, right? To Kibbutz Raim. I think there is quite a bit here to suggest that they were not aware that this festival was going to be held. But you know, I think at that point it's really just, well, what do? You know, you're halfway through this military operation. You're certainly not going to stop and, you know, redirect your efforts and try to, you know, I'm sure it threw kind of a wrench in the works, if anything. I think I would imagine that they probably weren't really entirely sure what to do. And I think that kind of filters out in terms of the variety of footage that we've seen, where you can see this huge gradient in terms of the treatment of Israelis, where some of them are there's footage that indicates some Israelis were just basically executed. And then there's other footage showing Hamas guys hanging out with, you know, grandmas and posing with rifles, and it's totally, you know, it's like night and day. So I think, given that, you know, that if we're going to use that as a data point here, I would say it kind of, we're leaning towards they really didn't know that festival was taking place, that it was going to be there at all, and that it probably was kind of more of a problem than it was, you know, some big opportunity from their perspective. But that's, you know, obviously speculation at this point.
and now we can talk about the hospital that Wyatt is so excited to talk about. So our listeners do know that the hospital's actually been there since like the 40s, and it was or at least the 40s, and it was originally a British Army barracks, actually, and it was converted and given over to the government in 1946, and then it was occupied in 1967 by Israel, and they actually took everyone there prisoner. So there's a good amount of history. There's about it has a 700 person or 700 bed capacity currently, or most recently was operating well beyond that, in addition to housing thousands upon thousands of Palestinian refugees. So for sake of the timeline, so let's pull up the cartoon. This is what the IDF shows us to tell us why they need to raid Al-Shifa Hospital. This is very sophisticated. So this is what we were promised. We were promised an intricate system of tunnels and bunkers.
What were some of those rooms? Like, I'm kind of curious, what is going on in the other rooms? Some of them, I think there was just like a bed in one. I don't like, they had like a whole, I kind of want to replay the graphic.
All right, Ari, can we bring that back?
I want to see better now that we know that this is just total nonsense. It's completely manufactured. Like, what else did they make up while they're...
Ariana, can you pause it when it gets to the bunkers so we can have a look at the
okay, so when you watch it with what we were promised versus they delivered.
No, so these are weapons stockpiles. So they have a whole bunch of rockets in one bunker, And another one. There's all the fuel. There's all the fuel that they've been
That they stole.
stealing from the rest of the Palestinians. There's no medical equipment here, which makes you wonder why they had to go behind the MRI to store their guns.
This is the coup d'etat. This is the cell. This is the nucleus of the
Right.
operation. This flag and a carpet.
Yeah,
And four
4
chairs.
laptops. That was probably where they got one of those laptops from.
Laptops, yeah.
That
So it's one of my favorites. It's probably my favorite. So that's when they tell us that was the 27th of October, which now seems like an eternity. But that was when they tell us we have to raid. Hamas is underneath. We have no choice. 3 November is when they start bombing the ambulance convoys, which they said Hamas was using to transport weapons, which Hamas said no. And then 7 November, Human Rights Watch says that was an unlawful action and should be investigated as a war crime, yet another Israeli war crime. Then they destroyed the solar panels. Then on the 11th, they said they would transport babies, which is like, why would you give your babies to the IDF? And then on 14 November is when the raid actually begins. And this is when Max kind of tweeted that what Sabrina Singh press conference, and your article came out right around that time as well. So 14 November, if you could pull up what I want to point out about this press conference is this video is kind of long, but the most important part is the part that you point out in your article. So if Aria could run that really fast, the press conference at the White House with Sabrina Singh. Okay, maybe not. Anyway.
Right. I can kind of paraphrase her remarks. I mean, the specific remarks that I think were probably the most interesting was she told reporters that the U.S. intelligence community, as they like to call it, had no, quote, boots on the ground, that it didn't have intelligence assets that were capable of independently gathering intelligence. And as I point out in this article that you mentioned, the headline is Biden admin justifies Israel's assault on Gaza hospitals with recycled Israeli intelligence. As I point out in this article, Sabrina Singh, the DOD spokeswoman, was asked repeatedly by journalists at this briefing whether that this supposed intelligence that the U.S. claims to possess, was coming from the Israelis, and she refuses on multiple occasions to elaborate, to expand on where exactly it comes from. It looks like we found the video, so I can just let her speak for herself.
We do have information that Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad uses some hospitals in the Gaza Strip, including the Al-Shifa Hospital, as a way to conceal and support their military operations and hold hostages. They have tunnels underneath these hospitals. And so Hamas and PIJ members operate a command and control node from Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. They have weapons stored there and are prepared to respond to an Israeli military operation against the facility. So this is, I'm just telling you what we as the intelligence community assesses is happening in Gaza City, how Hamas is using these hospitals to operate. But absolutely, we do not want to see a firefight in a hospital where there are innocent civilians. Fadi.
So you said that you don't have any forces on the ground, right?
That's right.
So I take it this intelligence assessment is gathered based on information provided by Israel?
Sorry, what I just read out, that's from our intelligence community.
So did you have any assets inside Gaza?
We have no assets or boots on the ground in Gaza.
So there's no gathering on the ground about this?
That's right.
So you have no one entering the hospitals to verify this information, right?
We have no boots on the ground in Gaza.
No boots on the ground in Gaza.
This is so ridiculous.
You like that? That was such a bizarre, rare phenomenon of a reporter in one of those rooms actually asking follow-up questions and really putting her on the spot and making her clarify, oh, the United States does not have U.S. intelligence assets on the ground. So where is this coming from? Obviously, read between the lines, it's coming from Israel. Then later on in that clip, at the end, Singh is asked, well, then like, what is, I think she was asked why about the timing. And she said, quote, "This is a newly downgraded information that we felt was important to get out today because there have been a lot of questions about the hospital and how Hamas operates. And so it was important to get out there." So you have to remember, this came out right as this IDF lie about Al-Shifa terror tunnels was getting widely debunked. You have to remember, this was, I believe, the 15th, right? 4 days ago. So this was right when that one of those first really comical Israeli propaganda videos came out, and it was just like everybody on social media was trashing them, and they were getting ratioed, and it was just very clear that this was not going the way the IDF had hoped it would. And so then you had the U.S. kind of step in, bring out the big guns. Okay, we're going to come in and help you guys out, back you up on these absurd claims that are honestly kind of self-evidently false. But it's not actually about whether or not it's true or false. It's just about providing Israel with political cover to do what it wants to do, which in this case is effectively annex North Gaza, presumably then move on to the south.
But in your art, like, I wanted to ask you, because I'm like, maybe, do you think that she could just be lying about having boots on the ground, or have they just really gotten to the point where they're like, we don't care anymore? We don't care what you think. We're just going to play telephone. Maybe we'll get OSINT and we'll be on our way. Or do they actually have intel on the ground?
Well, she's not the first one to indicate the U.S. is relying entirely on OSINT. This was also a point made by Jake Sullivan, I believe, the national security advisor. He said that, quote, "open source reporting shows that, quote, Hamas does use hospitals along with a lot of other civilian facilities for command and control, for storing weapons, for housing its fighters." So, you know, if this was indeed just open source intelligence, using the term very loosely there, then this is something that the U.S. government has in the past said that it is relying on for this assessment that they apparently have now that, you know, there are terror tunnels under all the hospitals.
So follow-up question to that. Should the U.S. then conduct an own independent analysis or investigations into Al-Shifa or anything really that's happening in Gaza right now, instead of relying on just information that's provided by obviously their allies, especially when it comes to military actions in these international conflicts? I mean, how can we, how can the Biden administration in any way ensure the accuracy of this so-called intelligence it receives from Israel when it leads them to justify this military action and genocide?
Well, the Biden administration is all in on this. The Biden administration has made it repeatedly clear on numerous occasions that they have no intention of stepping in. Biden was asked point blank, you know, are you going to call for a ceasefire? No, not going to happen. And honestly, this kind of presumes that there is a meaningful distinction between the U.S. and Israeli intelligence, which just sort of, you know, I don't think that the U.S. intelligence community, especially under Biden and more importantly under Anthony Blinken, whose grandfather was instrumental in creating Israel to begin with, I don't think you can trust them to operate in any independent way from the Israeli government, because at the end of the day, their goal is to facilitate the long-term ethnic cleansing that the Zionists have been very open about wanting to carry out for many years. This is Joe Biden has been one of the most vociferously pro-Israel voices in the U.S. government, and that's saying something. Over the past decades, he's a man who openly said if there was no Israel, the United States of America would have to create her. So this is a man who views Israel as inseparable in many ways from the United States, kind of as the 51st state. So I don't think there really is any universe in which there's some independent United States intelligence assessment going to be gathered. If they did have, you know, intelligence assets on the ground, I'm sure the same thing would happen to the intelligence that was gathered you know, as always happens when the United States wants a war versus when it doesn't, the conflicting evidence disappears. The people behind it end up, you know, locked in some basement office, and the people behind the nonsense that the military, the security establishment wants to hear, the national security establishment wants to hear, they of course rise to the top. And you know, this is what we saw in Iraq. This is what we saw with the so-called WMDs all throughout the early Bush years, was that intelligence was not accepted on its actual merits or veracity alone. It was accepted on its political expediency and utility.
So I do want to come back to that, because I want to ask you about the United States and what their desires are. But still on the topic of the hospital, we get at 7. We've raided the hospital on 14th of November. We got the video that you mentioned that was deleted and then re-released. That was a 7-minute video on the 17th of November. It takes 3 days for us to get any real video evidence of the interior of Al-Shifa Hospital. And then it's pretty much immediately debunked by all places, the BBC area. If you could play the video and then we'll talk about all of this.
Israel described the Al-Shifa Hospital as the main headquarters for Hamas's terrorist activity. This IDF animation, posted in late October, claims to represent a Hamas tunnel system underneath the hospital. But having been inside Al-Shifa since early Wednesday, Israel's yet to produce evidence of the tunnels. It has allowed the BBC and Fox News to film at the hospital, though only locations of Israel's choice.
This is what they found.
Israel also released its own 7-minute video, which BBC Verify has analysed. A watch, visible in that video, suggests it was filmed a few hours before the BBC arrived. And this IDF video was posted, then deleted, then reposted, this time without a section referring to an Israeli soldier who'd been held hostage.
I don't know when this was used the last time.
Also in the video, we see a room with an MRI machine.
And if you zoom in and we get some light over here, what you'll be able to see is military equipment.
The BBC was shown the same room. And what we see in the two videos doesn't precisely match. For example, there's one gun in the IDF video, 2 by the time of the BBC footage. Israel has told BBC Verify this is because more weaponry and terrorist assets were discovered throughout the day.
And as always, an AK-47.
Israel also says its video is a single shot with no edits. But this appears to be an edit. We don't know the reasons for that edit, nor how significant it is. The IDF, though, says suggestions it's manipulating the media are incorrect. The IDF video also shows military equipment in other locations, though we can't verify how it came to be there. And what we see in this IDF video doesn't equate to Israel's description of Al-Shifa as an operational command center for Hamas. The US is using a different phrase, saying Al-Shifa was used as a command and control node. That implies a much smaller facility. Israel is adamant this hospital was a command center, but for now, at least, it's either not found supporting evidence or it's not sharing it. Back to you, Sophie.
I'm really outraged because I was promised an entire Hamas mole village with oil fields, and maybe a garden, and probably a university, and I got an MRI machine with guns stuffed in it, I think, and some WD-40, and then
I was looking forward to seeing this modern marvel of engineering that no one else on planet Earth has ever managed to do, but somehow these Palestinians under the world's worst blockade are able to create this massive underground tunnel network. I think Mario Nafal said that there were 500 kilometers, I think, and they were 80 meters underground. And I remember trying to do the math on how much dirt would you have to displace for 500 kilometers. And I was like, okay, let's say 2 square meters times 5, 2 square meters for somebody to walk in, times 500 kilometers, and it turned out to be like 400 Olympic swimming pools full of dirt that would get moved. And it's like, where would that go? Did they just dump it all in the ocean? Like, where did they put the dirt that they made? You know, they displaced, creating this massive. All of these things kind of fall apart as soon as you think about them for more than 3 or 4 seconds. But you know, I guess not everyone's up to the task.
It's so bad that they put it by the MRI machines, which obviously would magnetize any weapon. So that's the last place you would want to store anything metallic, no?
Can you
But
imagine?
they even right, like they even failed to think about that, or were completely unaware of this. So it's just ridiculous.
I actually expected when he says that the IDF suggested that any suggestions that the IDF manipulated this video are incorrect. I expected him to say are anti-Semitic. I was like kind of surprised.
We're all conditioned to just
We're conditioned.
We're all like, all right, here we go. And then today, because you brought up Mario, see if Area has it queued. Today, Mario posts a new video from the IDF, which finally shows us the tunnels that we've been promised. I don't know if you've seen this, Wyatt, but and I'm sure a lot of our viewers haven't, because this was today. So I don't want to show the whole thing, but Area, if you could just keep going through it, because I want a refund. Like, do we have a receipt on Israel? Because this is not what I was promised. And again, they tell us this is the video. It's all intact. We didn't touch anything.
How did they climb down there? Are they rappelling down this? I'm genuinely. I mean, there aren't like bars on the wall, are there?
No. Hold on.
So I mean, my first reaction was, okay, maybe they finally found the tunnels that they built underneath this hospital when they controlled it in the 80s.
The cut. Did you see the cut? Here it comes. Go back. I think the cut was around, what was it, 122 maybe? But it cuts to a different tunnel.
Yeah. Right. Okay. There we go. Okay. Now where are we?
Yeah, that came out of nowhere.
We've like somehow been just like magically transported to another
catacombs.
Right, now we're under Paris. Like, why do they do this to us? Like, what? Why? Like, is this? They're spending. They're telling us this is a budget that's even larger than the Ukrainian propaganda PR campaign budget. It's bad. It's bad. Like, why even bother? Why even bother showing me that tunnel? And
well, I think because the audience isn't like skeptical, younger people who are more inclined to kind of question what's happening on this issue. I think the audience is just, Zionists and kind of mainstream America, and their assumption, and it's mostly been true for the past 50 years, is just if we say something, then they'll accept it. So I don't think, this is the thing where I don't think they've had to try very hard historically on this propaganda stuff. And now we're kind of just realizing how flimsy it all is. And, I think it's worth asking also, the timing of this, like why all of a sudden are the BBC and CNN willing to exercise like the minimum level of skepticism? And I think that, honestly, I'm interested in you guys' thoughts on this, because I'm not totally sure where I stand. Part of me thinks it's kind of like a generational thing where there are actually Arabs working at some of these networks and they're more sympathetic, and like, maybe the younger generation is like, is less willing to be labeled Islamophobic or something. I'm not entirely sure what I chalk up this newfound skepticism among the media about Israeli claims to, but it's definitely worth kind of getting into, I think.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to get into this with you. It seems like what the West doesn't really need the real facts of what so-called Hamas did, either on October 7th or with these bases or whatever. What they need more so is this for this genocide propaganda to continue, is to generate this feeling within people around what happened, that this was, October 7th was unique. It was uniquely savage. It was uniquely atrocious. So they sensationalized that a lot. And so
the biggest pogrom since the Holocaust, right? The biggest slaying of Jewish people since the Holocaust. That's how it's being
Yeah, so it's that together with the language that I wanted to talk to you about as a journalist. You probably have a lot to say on this. The language that is being used also to describe all Muslims, right? So we know that Western leaders, since the beginning of this, and all of the mainstream media, now a couple are, like the BBC are kind of going back, but they mobilized, every single racial trope that they can find to refer to what's happening. They've used themselves words such as savages, barbarians, human animals, and whatnot to describe all Palestinians, not just Hamas, and then use this as this kind of logical conclusion to collectively punish all Palestinians and justify this genocide, while at the same time they also ignore any historical context or any conversation around historical context. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the biased language that you've noticed on both ends and the terminology that's been used in mainstream media to essentially create this skewed narrative.
Yeah, well, it honestly surprised me. I will say I didn't expect it to be quite so openly racist. I thought that, the media had kind of, since the post 9/11 era, I thought that this was kind of a lesson that the establishment media had thought that it learned, or, that then, now we all look back at that time and we think, oh, wow, that was an incredibly racist moment in American history. Of the bizarre hate crimes that were taking place to just like anybody who was perceived to be Muslim, including like Sikhs, right? People who were not Muslims themselves, who were just perceived that way. And then we had this moment right after October 7th. It's like, wow, we are just like, we took a time machine and we went back to the early 2000s when all of a sudden it was like acceptable to use this kind of language, the human animals, the savages. And this, started, it obviously originates on Israeli media, but then it makes its way over very quickly because the media in the week after October 7th was just a nonstop Israeli talk show, basically. I remember, and Max at the Grayzone also pointed this out, and maybe we can pull this video up at some point. But he noted that over a 2-hour period, the CNN aired exclusively Jewish presenters, Zionist Jewish presenters, and Zionist Jewish guests. And the only exception to this was an Arab Christian woman who was married to a Zionist Jewish guy who was raising her kids Zionist Jewish, right? So that was it. That was the only thing you could see on mainstream media for weeks. And so of course it was just, straight IDF propaganda and talking points. But, and I'm not, so again, I'm not sure if there was, some straw that broke the camel's back, or it's also kind of a compelling explanation to me that I think there is a level here where these people are just kind of weather vanes, and, they're determining which way the wind is blowing, and they're seeing that there is this huge segment of American society that isn't buying the Israeli narrative, that is viewing them as, and rightly so, is viewing legacy media as complicit in selling the Israeli narrative, whether it be in just mindlessly repeating the 40 beheaded babies lie that was mindlessly repeated by Biden. All of these, I think maybe there was kind of a moment, a moment in which some of these networks are hearing from their reporters, or just, checking out social media and realizing, okay, we need to at least pretend to tell the other side of the story a little bit more. Otherwise, we're just going to lose all credibility with younger voters.
Well, I also think that, we're still coming off the Ukraine-Russia war. And that was like, it wasn't as bad as this, but the propaganda for that was, we were debunking that left and right. So maybe there's a little bit of leftovers from that. So kind of like the same style of propaganda. I remember in the beginning, Aria and I were looking at a bunch of Twitter accounts, and we were like, these are the same people that ran the Ukrainian accounts. It's the same language, it's the same format and everything. So I think a lot of it is, a lot of us were like, this silly stuff with Ukraine, they really can't recycle it that quickly. It hasn't even been 5 years yet.
And it shows just the true double standard. I mean, do you remember early on, in the first month or two after the war kind of kicked off, March 2022, there was this video in which, and I can't remember, if it was a Turkish outlet put it out, but you could very clearly see Ukrainian militants riding around in ambulances, even driving to a hospital, and they're wearing full military gear, right? And so it was obvious the Ukrainians are carrying out, here's another war crime. They're just caught. You've been busted, right, by a mainstream outlet, and it was just radio silence, right? And here, there's these endless repetition of these claims that, oh, Hamas is running around in an ambulance. There's not a single picture. There's not a single video. And so I think it is kind of easy for people who are a little bit more skeptical of the mainstream media narrative to just be like, wait, weren't you saying this was a genocide, that the Russians were carrying out a genocide just months ago? And now all of a sudden, Hillary Clinton tweeting a year ago saying, oh, when you bomb a tip for the Russians, when you bomb a hospital, that's called a war crime. That's the only word for it. What happened to that Hillary Clinton? How do we reanimate
where's the
that
condemnation
past
today?
Hillary Clinton and place her here to where it is actually happening, right? It's not just some propaganda that the Ukrainians imagined. It's real and it's verified by all sorts of mainstream media. And there's just, this obvious hypocrisy, this obvious double standard. I think that is part of why this propaganda isn't catching on quite so well. Yeah. Very simple point. If Russian leadership would rather not be accused of committing war crimes, they should stop bombing hospitals. Good point, Hillary.
Thanks, Hillary. Shout out to Hillary Clinton.
Shout out to Hill Dog.
War criminal extraordinaire. Now telling other people how to avoid being accused of war crimes. Fantastic.
She could write a book on that.
This little weird thing that came out today. Maybe we want to touch on that, Yara. The IDF now, they released footage from cameras inside of Al-Shifa Hospital showing the Hamas fighters taking Israeli hostages to get medical care and treat the detainees. Previously, the IOF said that they had no way of seeing their hostages because Hamas destroyed all of the cameras inside of the hospital. So just another kind of silly thing that, maybe just doesn't line up. But I think Yara...
They said they covered them up, too.
Right, they covered them up.
They showed photos in which the cameras were covered with some kind of cloth that looked like rubber banded over it. But it wasn't clear who put those there. Could have been the Israeli military for all we know. And more than likely was, since apparently they're now saying that these cameras were in use very recently. And I would imagine that the Palestinians would want to document the Israeli army coming and kind of conquering this hospital. So to me, it just doesn't make sense why any Palestinians, or why Hamas specifically, would want to stop that from being caught on camera. Doesn't make sense.
So I do want to ask you, as a journalist and you seeing all of this propaganda playing out in front of you, we have over 50 claims now, probably closer to 60, of debunked propaganda from Israel's side. So what is how can people challenge these media narratives a little bit more and become maybe smarter when it comes to conducting independent research? Because I think that 9/11 was kind of the first iteration of us realizing that we'd been lied to, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. Then COVID was kind of a second iteration of that, and now we're seeing all of the lies coming out of Israel, and people are really understanding what's really happening in Palestine. So now that we have kind of this momentum going in a way, what is your thought pattern behind how people can actually, first of all, do you think we're winning the information war on a global scale? And second of all, how can we continue challenging people to not just believe everything they see, especially when it comes to the mainstream media, and understanding the larger narratives at play?
The answer to how can we get people to not so readily
Except,
Israeli
yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the answer is simple and it's not. I mean, the short answer is to tell people to stop believing everything that the Israeli military says, to stop taking their claims at face value, to look into this very long history of disinformation, of outright lies and deceit that's accompanied really every Israeli military adventure since its creation. I mean, we don't even really have to look terribly far back in the history books. We can go back to Shireen Abu Akleh, right? This Palestinian American journalist, very famous in Palestine, who was murdered by an Israeli sniper while covering protests in the Jenin refugee camp, while surrounded by other members of the press, nowhere near hostilities, and wearing press vest and helmet, obviously labeled her press in big bright letters. And so the Israeli claims around this incident, around this episode, were kind of instructive. I mean, they changed very quickly and they changed very frequently. The first claim, as I recall, was that no one had been shooting that day, that the Palestinians killed her, right? That was kind of the first claim, that, oh, you know, these terrorists killed their own journalist. And then step by step, over the next couple weeks, we slowly worked from, okay, well, it's possible that she could have been hit with a Israeli bullet, but unlikely. That became, well, it may have happened, but it certainly wasn't on purpose. You know, she wasn't being targeted. It was crossfire. And then finally, several weeks, several weeks later, almost a month later, I believe, they actually admitted, right, that they were behind this. They kind of offered this non-apology, but it didn't really have the same widespread international outrage happen. I think, you know, it was one person who was obviously widely beloved within the occupied territories, but it wasn't this daily kind of assault on the conscience of the world public that we're seeing right now. So you didn't have necessarily as much, I think, pushback, and you didn't have as much of a reaction, at least from Western audiences, when that happened. But nevertheless, the pattern is there, where you see, okay, your narrative is entirely divorced from the facts as they happen. You only see facts as something to be conceded when there is no alternative, right? This is not a government that can be treated with, you know, with any or can be given any real credence when it says these things, because the fact of the matter is it just lies so consistently about everything. And, you know, so I mean, my personal way of kind of getting people to be more skeptical was explaining that this government just lies about everything. And if you take that as a starting point, that what they are saying is just as likely to be a lie as it is the truth, and there's no real way, you know, what the Israeli government says does not actually count as evidence in favor or against any claim. It is just a claim. And as soon as we can, you know, get more people to have that mentality with it, and it certainly helps to have more people, especially in establishment media, hitting this kind of first step of just, oh, wait, perhaps there is a difference between reality and what Israel says. You know, I think that's a big starting point. It's a big jumping off point. I don't want to read too much into it, especially when it comes to the mainstream media. But if they're able to kind of keep that energy up, I would be more optimistic about where we are going forward.
And lastly, earlier you mentioned something alluding to the fact that the United States wanted this war, and I don't know if I agree with that. And Yara, do you agree with that? I don't think the United States wants this war. I think I'm not really sure that they've
I
done
think we've heard from kind of military experts and stuff that the US plays both sides so that, it makes sense for them to get involved because they can sell their military, weapons to everyone. Therefore, they make more money. And also, I do think that they want this war because we did talk to Pepe Escobar last week about the Ben Gurion Canal, the India-Middle East corridor, and the strategic interest that exists there. That, like, as you said earlier, Wyatt, Biden himself said in '86 that if there were no Israel, they'd have to strategically have one there to protect their interests. So I do, to an extent, believe, but I'd be interested in having this conversation for sure.
Well, my take is just that the Israelis certainly and the United States political establishment has always viewed the Palestinians as a problem and an obstacle to be overcome, to be disposed of, discarded, dumped somewhere, but just, get rid of them, get them out of the way. They're just a big stick in the mud, and they're stopping, long-term U.S. geopolitical strategy. They are seen as an impediment because they are this thorn in the side of the Israelis. That they stop the Israelis, whether it be this proposed canal or pipelines that people are mentioning. That I've seen hyped up a great deal on social media, and I haven't actually researched as extensively as I should have. But whether it is because the Israelis want this for resource purposes, or whether they just view the Palestinian population as a long-term strategic threat to this Jewish majority, dynamic that they insist on having. Ultimately, the Palestinians are viewed as something to be done away with, and the United States position for many years has been to facilitate that process, and it's only gotten more overt in the past 15, 20 years, where you have kind of a refusal even by a lot of influential politicians, especially this is especially pronounced in the Trump administration. I'm not sure why I'm sideways, but the
Yo, why are you sideways?
Mossad is here. Mossad has gotten into the computer.
But okay, we'll try. Let's see how this works. Like, can I just turn myself over again?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, that seemed to work. But it's been very clear that the Israelis and the United States behind them have all seen the Palestinian problem as I'm sure they would put it, as something to be dealt with conclusively, right? And I think they view this as a wonderful, tremendous opportunity to do exactly that, to go out and ethnically cleanse Gaza, which is something that they've been wanting to do for many years. They regularly carry out what they call mowing the lawn in Gaza. Every few years, they want to depopulate it and teach it a lesson. And now I think they are just going much, much further than they have in those previous wars and sieges on Gaza.
I mean, it couldn't be more obvious now that they've committed their Nakba 2.0. They've essentially forcibly displaced, hundreds of thousands of people from northern Gaza now to southern Gaza. Now they also claim that there's a Hamas base in the south. So, it's just painfully obvious what's happening here for anyone who's actually paying attention.
Well, actually, so I would challenge Sarah, I would challenge you on this point. I would just say, if the United States does not want this to happen, where is your evidence for that? Where's your evidence that they don't want what's being carried out, the massacres being carried out in Gaza, to continue being carried out?
I don't think that they care about that, sadly. I don't think that they care about what happens to Gaza. I'm talking about the big war, the great war. I don't know if they're ready or that they want to engage with Iran right now. What I'm trying to get at is that Israel is kind of acting on it's on its own accord. It's acting like a rogue, as Dr. Finkelstein would say, a lunatic state. It's acting like an absolute lunatic state. It's out of control. I don't think that the United States is approving of a lot of these actions. They're kind of just like we're kind of tethered to this state and this maniacal state. And I think that the United States has shown a little bit of reluctance in the way that they're letting the media behave, in the way that some of the politicians are behaving, just kind of, there's a lot more flexibility than I remember there being after 9/11. Even a lot more flexibility than I remember for towing the line for Ukraine. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is that the official messaging is changing, which is making me feel like there's some sort of hesitation to want to get fully involved in a full-scale operation. I don't think that they care what happens to Palestine. I think that they'd be happy for Gaza to be destroyed and flattened. I think that they don't want Israel to continue to engage Hezbollah. They don't want more trouble in Syria and Iraq, and I just don't think that they want to take on Iran as as a full state entity.
I agree. Honestly, I agree. I think I think that's really the only thing limiting from the United States perspective. Like that's really the red line. They can do whatever they want in Gaza, but they're not allowed, I would say, to start a full-on regional war at this point. Right? I think I agree with you on that, if that's your point.
Well, yeah, I just don't think, because, I just had an episode, Yara wasn't there, but I did have an episode with Brian Berletich. I think it was Thursday. I don't know. And we talked about it a little bit, and I just don't think that the because in understanding that if that front opens, the front with Taiwan or something in the South China Sea is almost certainly going to open. And I don't think that we can handle a 3-front war. And I think a hesitancy comes from that too. So that's all I'm saying. I will never think that the United States cares who dies or who commits war crimes or any of that happening. I'm talking about the huge scale of things. The loss of hegemony can really be, it can be tenuous. The hegemony can be tenuous if 2 more fronts open up in this war. Ukraine is it's done, but it's technically not done as a war front, and Russia is continuing their march to the west. So sure. I'm just not sorry. My dog isn't enjoying this anymore. But I just don't. I don't think that they're ready for the big war as much as they grandstand and say that they are. But again, then someone.
Well, they're not. But I don't think necessarily that the Iranians or the Lebanese feel that they are ready for a major military conflict either. I mean, I don't think either the Hezbollah or the Iranians want a war. I think they've made that pretty clear from the speech that Nasrallah gave a couple of weeks ago. I think it was pretty clear that Hezbollah isn't interested in going to war, full-on war with Israel. That's why they continue to have these kind of skirmishes that rise in frequency and intensity as Israeli strikes on Gaza increase. That to me is as basically as far as they've shown themselves to be willing to go. The seizure today of the shipping freighter, the tanker by the massive container ship by Ansarullah,
Galaxy,
the so-called Houthi, Galaxy Leader, something like that. I think that was another escalation, right, by kind of the axis of resistance. That was another effort to say, okay, you guys are taking it too far, so now we have to show our willingness to escalate, go up this kind of strategic ladder of escalations. Okay, we are now going to imperil your shipping lanes through this enormously important transportation corridor. So, that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to see for the time being. I think we're kind of in a holding pattern. I don't think that this is necessarily going to spill over into World War III tomorrow. I think we've seen kind of all sides involved, except maybe the Israelis, show that they don't necessarily want to engage in like a regional war. So, I don't think that that's necessarily, going to happen right away. Although long term, it seems like, especially if the rest of the Gulf states do not normalize relations with Israel, as seems to be what's happening now, that the Saudi Arabians have gotten cold feet on their normalization deal. If that goes, that trend continues, and they ultimately align more with Iran than with Israel, then I think, at some point, yeah, maybe we will see the decision made from the West and from the Israeli perspective that, like, now it's time to just go all out and divide up the world and let the chips fall where they may. But, hopefully we're not quite there yet.
Well, we are at an hour, but if you do have time, we do have a special guest popping in. Maybe, I don't know, but we'll see if he shows up. But maybe Yara has a question or discussion in the meantime while we wait for him to grace us with his presence.
Yeah, I'm happy to stick
Yeah,
around
for
for a little bit longer.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I think you know him. You might know him.
Okay.
It's interesting, right? They say now Iran was behind the Houthi seizure of the ship in the Red Sea. They call it another act of Iranian terrorism. For those of you who maybe haven't seen this latest development, so this cargo ship was owned by an Israeli businessman, was hijacked by Yemen's Houthi rebels. This happened just recently today, and is today Sunday? Yeah, it is. And they essentially accused Iran of directing this what they call maritime piracy. Just very interesting how now they're bringing Iran into this and saying how it's another act of Iranian terrorism. I mean, just ridiculous.
They called excuse me. They called Iran a Nazi. They called it a Nazi octopus. So
Oh my God.
Okay. All right.
What was the tweet that it said? It said something like it's the Nazi terrorist regime, or the quote from today, the octopus of Iran's Nazi terrorist regime. It was really wild. It's
Who
getting
said
like
that?
the IDF, I believe.
What? Yeah, very unhinged. Ukraine level unhinged.
That's my tweet. Okay. We have warned the world several times that Iran is an octopus, and every terrorist act in the Middle East and the world is funded by the Nazi regime in Iran. Which is just great because 2 weeks ago poor Greta was just vilified in the media for her anti-Semitic octopus. But now they're telling me that Iran is a Nazi octopus in the Middle East. So maybe the octopus wasn't anti-Semitic after all. I'm not really.
So credit where it's due. I didn't think anyone could make me feel empathy for Greta, could make me like take her side. And then lo and behold, the Israelis, they did it. So hats off to the Israelis for making me side with Greta. Congratulations.
Hats off to the Israelis for creating a bunch of unity across the world for Palestine more than ever before. Doing a great job.
Do you think so? I asked Brian the same thing, so I'll ask you while we're waiting. But do you think that this is the end of Israel? Or at least the Zionist entity, like in that sense, like what does this signify? We've seen a huge shift. People are no longer willing to toe the line for Israel. What is this the end? Or are we going to see a resurgence?
Yeah, I try not to get too into these kind of predictions because I think there's so many variables at play that it's really hard to see how this shakes out. Questions like how long can just civilians in Gaza endure, just this day-to-day siege now that it's gotten so much worse? How willing are people to leave their homes in South Gaza now that they've seen what happened to those who fled North Gaza, right? So, I mean, there are elements of this where I think it's just kind of impossible to say for sure one way or the other. But it's hard to not feel like this is on some level the beginning of the end, right? Because I've just never seen this widespread sentiment, and it's especially pronounced in the Democratic Party. I don't think I've ever really seen the Democratic elite so out of touch with just the average Democratic voter, where 3/4 of the party is loudly saying, ceasefire now. and I think less like 2% of the members of Congress are willing to vote that way. So, but that's even the Republicans, right? Even 50% of Republican voters want a ceasefire. How many actual Republicans are willing to vote that way? I mean, Thomas Massey, sure, maybe I don't know how Rand Paul is voting on all this, but there are real signs that this is an issue which could kind of fracture the foundations of the whole thing if it's not treated appropriately by the U.S. government, and especially by the Israeli government, right? Which, as I noted earlier on, is just not used to having to really fight for hearts and minds in America so much. For so long, it was able to get away with like these idiot savages. That's just pointing towards like, look at these Arabs. They want to murder us. You guys know that because you saw what happened with 9/11, right? And now that's just, it's not just backfiring. We're having like the Guardian has to take down Osama bin Laden's letter to America. TikTok has to come out with this public pronouncement and explaining, we're not actually juicing the numbers and trying to convert young Americans to being Al-Qaeda sympathizers. Young people on our platform are just genuinely interested in what Osama bin Laden had to say in his letter. And so I do think there is something different here in the sense that I've never seen this widespread of a condemnation of anything that Israel has done, anything really U.S. vassal, or I don't know if they're a vassal at this point, but a U.S. kind of protectorate has been willing to do. This is the first time I'm seeing it, I think. And so it's hard not to feel like something has changed, generationally maybe, but just in terms of seeing kind of this large segment of both the right and the left that are saying, like not in our name, or no more foreign wars, or some variation of it that just indicates people are not interested in perpetuating another Israeli massacre of Palestinians.
Absolutely not. I think we see a lot of, we see so much proof coming out of just all these war crimes that are being committed by Israel and all these innocent civilians that are dying, that, I mean, it would be completely inhumane for the world not to have some kind of reaction to that, aside from obviously Zionists and people that have some kind of financial interests in death of Palestinians. But I think what worries me a little bit at this point of just the media coverage is the normalization of this death, this lack of empathy or understanding for the suffering of Palestinians. So I'm really worried that all this footage that we have from Palestine and still no change, right, on a more right, political, governmental level, that this desensitization is going to continue, and we're just going to normalize it, like in the past, because of how the media covers it. So that's not to say that the media doesn't cover it. They do to an extent, in as much as they're, I guess, allowed to, but what happens is that it's because it's not as sensationalized as October 7th was, people don't attach the kind of same importance to it, and so it leads to the suffering of Palestinians just doesn't matter as much as the suffering of people in Israel. So that's my main concern right now, because the media isn't going to ever cover any of, it's like you said, whenever with the journalist that got killed in the back of the head, there was no real outrage about that, aside from people that really knew what was going on or had been following what's going on in Palestine for a minute. There was no global outrage in the same way as there was this global outrage on October 7th. So it obviously, we've seen more than ever how some lives matter more than others, and how the ratio is completely disproportionate with deaths on both sides. That's what worries me now, just as a journalist, like this normalization of death in Palestine. Well,
I'll say that particular phenomenon you're referring to, this, the double standard, the media double standard there, sure, it worries me, but it also in some weird way kind of gives me hope, because for every just, crystal clear, super obvious example of the media treating Palestinians one way, having two separate rules for two separate populations. It drives people to ask questions, certain people to ask questions, right? So where you now have people like, Candace Owens, who I would have said, even several years ago, is just a firm fixture of the right, not going to be moved on this issue, very openly sort of pointing to this phenomenon, saying, why is it that I'm allowed to say that I mourn the victims of October 7th, but I'm not allowed to say that I mourn the Palestinian babies killed by Israeli airstrikes? Why is it that I can't say that? Why is it that we are accused of anti-Semitism for saying things that are just obviously not anti-Semitic, had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, even slightly, but were critical in some way of the Israeli government? As I said, it just doesn't really seem to be working as well anymore, and their ability to kind of bully and silence critics through things like the Canary List, maintaining for years these blacklists of people who spoke out in support of Palestinians, and try to get them fired from their jobs, try to prevent them from getting hired anywhere, try to get them kicked out of school. These attacks are just kind of diminishing in terms of their effectiveness, in terms of their ability to really truly censor people. And sure, it is upsetting to see, but on some level it's kind of gratifying. It's like, you know what? Stay so out of touch. Continue being so dramatically out of touch with what everybody else is saying, because it just makes you less and less a part of the conversation going forward. And frankly, that's, I think, a win for not just like myself on a personal level, but I think like all of humanity is better served by having the mainstream media clowns and liars be further alienated and isolated from normal people.
It is. It's true. I mean, we're seeing them expose themselves in 4K. So it's really for anyone who joined journalism to be a real journalist and to expose these kind of stories. It is hopeful in a way, because it is pushing a lot of journalists and people overall to want to learn how to verify their own information, to want to really understand what's happening. And it's a global movement at this point. You can call it an echo chamber all you want, but when you have millions marching in all the major cities in the world for free Palestine, at this point you've lost. And it is true. It's the horrifying thing is that we can't change anything about what's happening right now. But I do really believe that if we keep talking like this and we keep sharing and debunking and questioning all these narratives, that over time they're just not going to be able to sustain this. It's just too many lies piled on top of each other. And even when you mention the lies, which is the craziest thing, Propaganda & Co. had posted a tweet the other day of the 50 Israeli lies. And even when you mention the lies, they still removed that tweet and said it was violating Twitter's policies or whatever. So you cannot even question or mention the fact that they themselves are lying about all of this. And that's just the extent to which they're going through, which is crazy.
Look who it is.
Hey,
What were you doing?
who, me?
Yeah, were you eating?
I always have
filming an
stuff. I
Instagram
always have
story?
stuff in my teeth. I always have stuff in my teeth, so I had to get it out. Like, no, always.
Well, at least now
Anyway.
nobody knows about it.
No, nobody except all the wonderful viewers here. Hey, good to see you, Wyatt. Good to be with you, Sarah and Lara.
This is Yara. My
Yara, good
Nice
to
to meet you. Thank you.
good to meet you. Finally,
This is
thanks.
#1 China bro, Danny Haifeng.
Good to be here. Good to be here. Thanks for allowing me to pop in.
Yeah, why are you? What are you here for? What do you want? No, I'm just kidding. We were just talking about.
I'm just here to troll, you know.
Oh, go. Well, then, Danny, you have the
No,
floor.
I have nothing. I'm the anti-troll.
Danny, talk about what's going to happen now with Xi and Biden. You and Wyatt, tell us what happens with that trip. The trip to
What happened?
Can we
mean,
pull up the clip of Blinken? The Blinken
yeah,
screen?
we have to pull that up. We have to pull that up. So
We
while
have a
I'm
video.
while I'm
Ariel,
rambling, while I'm rambling, and then Wyatt's rambling, yeah,
pull
that
up
would be
the
great to
video
pull
that
up.
you made, Danny, or Area.
Let's see what happened. So, I mean, the Apex Summit happened. Xi Jinping went all the way to San Francisco, basically on they call it an invitation, but really it was begging, because this relationship has been completely ice cold for basically the good part of the year. And ever since the whole spy balloon incident back in February of this year. And so Xi Jinping actually agrees to go. This is after more than a half dozen meetings. Janet Yellen, Antony Blinken, you had Wang Yi go all the way to Washington to meet with Biden before this. And it was supposed to be relatively, both sides had very little expectations. There were, these things that happened during the summit, during the actual meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, military to military communication, some things on narcotics that were agreed upon. This is very small stuff. These are things that were happening even as relations were very cold from pre-February 2023 period, and China canceled them all because of the spy balloon incident. So after the meeting, Joe Biden just can't help himself. So he's giving a press conference on a myriad of topics. I mean, this always happens at Biden pressers after these kind of meetings. Reporters are asking him about a whole bunch of things. So, of course, one of the first questions is, do you still call Xi Jinping a dictator?
We have the video.
Yes,
Let's go.
we should play the video, and then we can react.
Still refer to President Xi as a dictator. This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Oh, he is. Hello, darkness, my old friend.
So that was caught on. That went viral because I mean, it was such a clear expression. There was also another aspect to this presser where Biden is talking about Palestine, Hamas, Gaza. They're asking him about the prisoners of war, or the hostages as they call them, and he essentially is looking at Blinken as Blinken is nodding his head no. And Mint Press actually, I think, was the first I saw report on this and show the video. And he goes, "Oh, yes, Mr. Secretary, I know. I should stop talking now." I mean, this is how bad everything looks. So, I mean, while it's not just the Xi Jinping dictator comment, this comment in particular is very, I think, startling to the United States foreign policy establishment, which was hoping, if anything, out of this summit, there was going to be no waves made in the case of plunging relations to a new low. Now, China is very mature. So China is not making the hugest deal of this. I mean, they've condemned the comments. I don't think that they're going to take away any of the minor agreements that they came to. But I do think that this kind of comment does have an impact in terms of trust, right? I mean, this is you, the United States, begging Xi Jinping to come. They want China to help with the economic situation. Of course, they're always asking China to help out with all of their foreign policy mess. You know, can you please help Iran, Russia? They're always asking for help on that level, which is ridiculous, but they always do. So there were supposed to be no waves made, but this comment, that face by Antony Blinken, and now Antony Blinken, of course, is no master of diplomacy himself. Arguably, he's one of the worst diplomats, if the United States ever had diplomats, which I don't think they really do. But he is not even able to really play the part or act the part, so to speak. So he is really no one to make these kind of faces, but it's quite clear that he made this face because he did not want to, no one, I don't think, in Biden's cabinet, in the Pentagon, anywhere, even in intelligence, wanted him to say these kind of things at that very moment. You know, maybe wait a week, maybe wait a couple weeks, but he couldn't even wait an hour. Xi Jinping was still in the United States. He was still in California at that time. So all this is to say is that it just is clear that Biden's mind is not just addled, but I think is a clear reflection. You know, it's one thing to have an addled brain, but it's also one that clearly reflects what the United States actually thinks about China, what it actually wants to do with regard to China, and that isn't changing because of this meeting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it shows you they rolled out the red carpet for him, right? And they cleaned up San Francisco. They swept up all the homeless people. They gave it kind of the Olympics treatment, just to make it seem like a Disneyland version of the city, where you don't have this massive, tremendous drug problem. You don't have this massive issue of just kind of addicts living in the street, openly using. And I want to say also, when discussing this kind of Blinken-Biden relationship, I think it's another point in the column of who is actually in charge of the Biden administration, that being Anthony Blinken, right? Who's actually the one calling the shots? Who is Biden bouncing ideas off of? Who is he looking for in the audience for validation and confirmation that he's checked the right boxes? It's Blinken, right? So I think this kind of confirms in some way something that a lot of us have been saying for a long time, which is that Biden isn't really in charge of his own administration. He's kind of a bystander. He's having scripts fed to him, and he's not able to read them particularly convincingly. And the natural result is that like nuclear level cringe, where you see the soul leaving Blinken's body, where he's just, how could you, we spent all this time trying to patch up this relationship and go back, I think, towards like a more sort of Kissinger style. Okay, we're gonna try to divide and conquer when it comes to Russia and China, and then Biden just shits the bed and falls for this obvious gotcha question. And then another interesting angle, I think, that kind of backs this up is Xi spending relatively little time talking to Biden. And I think, sitting at a table with people like, what's his name? The BlackRock guy, Larry, I'm blanking on his last name. But all these like titans of industry, huge, finance guys. I think that's who Xi Jinping was more interested in speaking with than somebody like Biden, who he probably, guesses that there's really not a whole lot of point to trying to engage him, because can he even hold a conversation? Does he actually know what's being said at any given moment? Who knows?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely true. And I think that comment you made, Wyatt, about the titans of industry giving Xi Jinping a round of applause in San Francisco, I think is emblematic of China's larger strategy in terms of how to weather the storm of U.S. aggression, or suicidal aggression, we should call it, because this has been China's strategy for many, many years, which is to be so ingratiated, be so interconnected with the world economy that whatever moves the United States decides to make, whenever it decides to make them, are not going to be effective. They're not going to be able to lead to, for example, the kind of instability that the sanctions on Russia caused the world economy. Now, of course, Russia itself has been very resilient, and I think the numbers right now are incredible in terms of growth in Russia, upwards of 5%. But nonetheless, China does not want to see that kind of activity directed toward itself, and arguably it has been the target of lower level kinds of sanctions from the United States. But it's more thinking about, well, what is the impact on the world economy? Because if the world economy is not doing well, then China has a lot more trouble meeting its own goals. And so that display, that picture, that imagery of Xi Jinping being applauded by basically the biggest stakeholders in the United States, those who actually control the levers of power, show a dynamic that has been brewing under the surface, that there is dissatisfaction. For example, people like Elon Musk definitely do not want China to be decoupled from, because that would be disastrous for his investments. There are many like him. So I think that in the end, Wyatt is exactly right that China is more interested, of course, in the economic players, because I don't think they have who could have any hope in the U.S. political class when it is led by people like Antony Blinken, who are just out and out neocons. They have no, they have absolutely no tact. They have no ability to conduct actual diplomacy, to develop relations in a way that are balanced and steady and fair. They don't have any sense of that. They can only think about how to advance their own careers, which at this point with China, for someone like Antony Blinken, only by scoring points on aggression and Cold War politics and policies, those are the only things that are going to advance Antony Blinken's career. I mean, I couldn't see him anywhere else, really.
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed. So I did talk to Brian Berletic the other night, Danny, and so I'll ask you too. But he said, we were talking about it being like a multi-front World War III situation for obvious reasons, and understanding that Russia has won on the Ukrainian front. And then Brian's argument was that there's no way for Israel to lose on the Israeli front. But my issue is that they have to lose all three, because the third front would be Southeast Asia, and they're not going to win in Southeast Asia. So how, and his argument was that Israel still sticks around as a state.
Well, I mean, it's a huge question. In the short term, I definitely see that. In the long term, of course, what Israel is doing, I think, is absolutely suicidal to the Zionist project as a whole, because eventually something is going to give, whether it's regionally or whether it truly is. I mean, I think people underestimate Palestinian resistance. I don't believe that it is possible to simply eradicate the entire Palestinian population. I actually don't even think that right now the situation on the battlefield, if we could call it even that, because I think it's far different from what's going on in Ukraine. It is much more of an anti-colonial guerrilla warfare struggle, so incredibly hard to measure any kind of semblance of victory. I mean, Ho Chi Minh said during the U.S. I believe it was the U.S. war of aggression in Vietnam, like, you can kill hundreds of us and we may only get 10 of you, but we're still going to win. Like that, it's that kind of mentality that I think helps sustain a resistance. So regardless of what people think of Hamas, is Hamas the correct resistance outlet, leadership? I mean, that all is for the Palestinian people to ultimately decide. But I do think that it is not possible. There's going to be more casualties. There's going to be more deaths. We know this. But at the same time, I'm not so sure that Israel is as stable, medium term and long term, as we may predict. I mean, even just this event, I think, shows how fragile, how sensitive Israel and Israeli leadership is to any kind of incursion or disturbance to their overall project just in Palestine proper. This is even to get into how we've only seen, I think, the beginnings of the regional situation becoming more and more inflamed. And I think a lot of analysts, Scott Ritter, others, have talked about the patience and all of this. And I think that's all true. However, patience can only go on so long before it becomes cowardly, right? So there's only so long that something like this can go on. There will be another, regardless of what happens here, whether it's a week, another month, another 2 months, eventually things will have to die down, or we'll get what I'm talking about a lot sooner. And when it does, there will be another instance where this happens. And I think that's what this is teaching us. This moment is teaching us that this is part of the overall Israeli project, Zionist project. And with that comes immense pressure on the entire world, but especially the region, to eventually sacrifice whatever the other stakes that are being considered, the regional economy. All of these things are obviously being considered by a lot of these players. There's sanctions everywhere along the region. There's so many different factors. I mean, Syria is basically still fighting a war. So while it is difficult, we see the resistance there. It's there. We see U.S. installations being attacked by Syrian and Iraqi resistance forces. We see Hezbollah taking some action, light action that it can sustain. And we also see, well, at least it's hard to see, but we do know, and there are reports that well, of course, there are significant Palestinian deaths, and this is a literal genocide. They're fighting. They are fighting, and nothing coming out of Israel makes me believe that somehow there's going to be some decisive victory over Hamas. That feels absolutely out of reach. So with that, what does that mean? Does that mean that Hamas loses? Sure, you could say that because of all these dead Palestinians, you could say, oh, they lost. But at the same time, Israel is losing the public relations war, is becoming more and more isolated. It will become more and more isolated even after this is over. So losses will be incurred on all sides, I believe.
So, final thoughts from everyone. Is this the end of United States hegemony and another phase in the ultimate end of United States? I already know Danny's answer because Danny and I are both very utopian thinkers. But is this another sign of the end times for the United States global hegemony, coming from the context of Ukraine, Russia, now Israel, and then possibly future Southeast Asia?
Well, if you know Danny's answer already, then I'll go. I've been saying really before even the Ukraine disaster that the fix is in. That this really we're headed only in one direction long term geopolitically, and that is towards multipolarism. That is an irreversible trend. It does not matter how many new proxy wars the United States pushes, creates, and maintains. Long term, there is only one direction, and that is towards a more either UN actual rule-based order instead of the so-called liberal rules-based order, or whether that be some form of regionalism. How exactly that looks has yet to be determined. But we know that the current status quo, as it pertains to the international realm, is just not sustainable. It's not working for the rest of humanity. And if you've spent any time in the United States, it's certainly not working for us here either.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with that. And just add a few things. I mean, in terms of U.S. hegemony being over, in many ways, the United States' credibility with regard to its hegemony is over. I mean, just in the last less than 24 hours, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, while regardless of whether we think this is a genuine show of support and solidarity with Palestine, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia is going to be going on a tour to try to galvanize international support for the end of the war on Gaza. And his first stop is not Washington. His first stop is going to be Beijing. So that alone, I think, demonstrates that when it comes to matters of global importance, the United States certainly is not the first that countries in the global majority, nations in the global majority, in the global South call. They do not call on the United States anymore. When there is development that needs to be had, when there's diplomacy that needs to be done, it is China, and to some extent, and to a good extent, Russia as well, that countries are calling, that nations are calling. So really, U.S. hegemony in the sense of politics, global leadership, in the sense of credibility, which all really matter, because Sarah used the word utopian. I think there's also something very real in terms of this contradiction between, yes, the United States still is the world's largest economy. It still has the world's largest military. It's obviously doing damage. Look at all the dead Ukrainians. Look at all the dead Palestinians because of its proxy wars there in these regions. But you could also say that just because the United States has this large economy and this large military, you could also say the United States hasn't really won anything in a very long time, won any war, any conflict of any kind by proxy or by direct invasion. I mean, could we say Iraq was a victory? Could we say Afghanistan was a victory? Could we say what has happened to Venezuela is a victory? Could we say any of the Syria, etc.? None of them have really been victories. Really, the United States wages war now and exerts its dominance in a manner that doesn't really lend to victory. It lends to chaos. And while chaos has its short-term advantages, it has long-term costs. And we're seeing that everywhere. what's happening with regard to Israel is having incredible long-term costs that are hitting us all in the face. I think anyone who's following this conflict with an ounce of in a shred of humanity sees that the credibility of Israel, its long-term legitimacy, is completely gone. It's eviscerated. There's nothing left of that. If it ever had it, I'm surprised that it ever had it. But look, many of us had spent a couple of years not really talking about Palestine because of the Ukraine conflict, because of the United States' push toward Cold War and World War III proper with Russia and China. It was really difficult to keep up with Palestine, which is constantly under siege and only in the news when either Palestinians fight back or Israel decides to mow the lawn. So with all of that said, I do believe that U.S. hegemony is, in terms of symbolism, leadership, diplomacy, the ability to exert any kind of credibility on the world stage, I think that's already over. And Wyatt brought up the great points about multipolarity, which is the replacement for that. The economic situation, and I think, of course, the military situation is a little more complicated because multipolarity will continue to spread. There's no doubt about it. Even countries like Saudi Arabia, as we've seen, have really jumped on that ship because they know it's the only stable one. However, the United States, as I said, has the ability to sow chaos, which does bring progress backward. It does hurt countries like, for example, Syria, who want to rebuild so badly. There are reports now they're interested in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Security and, of course, BRICS for economic cooperation. But it's going to be difficult for Syria to rebuild under the Caesar sanctions and, of course, all the other kinds of sanctions and war mongering that happens within its borders. So all of the countries in question, all these countries that are moving in this direction toward multipolarity, are facing significant challenges. They face the fact that the United States is doing everything it can to hold back multipolarity and to make sure it doesn't happen. Even China and Russia, they are accelerating the process because they have the means to do so. They are fiercely independent. They are bigger countries. They have advantages that many global South countries do not have. And even then, as you saw with the meeting in San Francisco, and as we will continue to see with U.S. policy toward China and toward Russia, we're going to continue to see challenges in the sense that the United States isn't going to stop trying to pull Russia into a conflict like it did with Ukraine, no matter if it has lost Ukraine. And the United States isn't going to give up its militarization of the Asia Pacific, which does have an effect. It doesn't necessarily have the biggest effect on economic ties. Even South Korea and Japan in these countries wouldn't dare decouple from China. But it is quite clear that countries like South Korea, the Philippines, these countries have a really difficult time not towing the U.S. line, which then impedes certain development projects. Maybe there are color revolutions, as we've seen in countries like Myanmar, Malaysia, etc., which do have an effect on China, China's relationship with countries in the global South. So it is all very complicated, and it's not linear, and it's not going to be necessarily smooth. But really, U.S. hegemony has been out the door in terms of its leadership, its ability to assert itself, and its legitimacy on the world stage. And it's only a matter of time before that starts to translate in massive economic losses, as we have seen the rudiments building up with developments like Saudi Arabia and Iran normalizing, and Syria and Turkey beginning to normalize, and these kind of developments that really do spell doom to every facet of U.S. hegemony.
So just to piggyback on that point a little bit. So is the United States ruling class done over with? No, obviously not. But the United States' credibility as an independent power broker on the global stage, that is gone. That's done. And that, to me, it speaks to kind of one of, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, one of the limiting factors, the few limiting factors that actually seems to compel the U.S. ruling class to try to rein in the Israelis, even if it's ever so slightly, is just the acknowledgement that, okay, we are co-signing all of these war crimes from the perspective of nearly the entire world. Meanwhile, when countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia want to seek out a rapprochement, who do they turn to? Do they go to Washington? No, they go to Beijing. when Hamas wants to be heard? Do they go to Washington? No, they go to the Qataris and they go to Moscow, right? So where is the role of the U.S. in terms of this, whatever future global order we have? Well, it certainly hasn't, and it hasn't described one. Our ruling class has not pushed forward any alternative to the reality as it currently stands, which makes people kind of wonder, well, like, what is the long-term plan? Are they ever going to acknowledge that the reality has shifted from what it was 20, 30 years ago? And the longer our ruling class refuses to do that, the more it jeopardizes its own ability to ever recover from that.
Well, if we want to end on a good note, Argentina just became the anarcho-capitalist society of our dreams. Congratulations, Argentina, for electing a Zionist ANCAP. I'm sorry, Yara.
Yeah.
Yara, you're muted. Yara, you're muted.
I said, as an Argentinian, let's not even. I can't even have a conversation right now. I need to
not
process.
open that. Let's not open that can of worms.
Pelotudo,
yeah, that's rough.
The boludo.
Boludo, ¿qué te pasa, loco?
Unfortunately, I think that was predicted, but yeah, no, that's.
Yeah, it was.
trash.
We were headed in that direction for a minute, but I mean, complete wide-scale currency collapse happening in Argentina right now. Worst hyperinflation ever, and I already know, my half of my family already lost their businesses and everything, and now they're going to be privatizing education, which is, one of the only things we have left. So it's a great time to be an Argentinian right now.
Well,
everyone's leaving. Everyone's leaving Argentina.
Yeah, I'm in Spain now. I can't be there anymore. No, it's impossible.
Yeah.
So why don't the listeners know, Wyatt, where you're at, what you're doing, where you'll be at, what's going on with you, etc., etc.
I am in an undisclosed bunker underneath Al-Shifa Hospital, surrounded by weapons.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah, you'll catch some clips that the IDF puts out on Twitter. See me in the background, I'm sure. No, I'm in Kentucky right now, but I'll be doing some traveling soon, and I'll keep you guys updated about that. Probably more after Christmas, but I'll let you know. Follow me on Twitter. It's at Wyatt Reed 13. You can keep up to date with what I'm doing and what we're covering, both personally and at the Grayzone. And feel free to reach out with any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions, or story ideas.
Danny, where are you at? What are you doing?
Sure. So you can follow me on YouTube. Just search my name, Danny Haifong, Rumble, Rockfin, all those platforms where I do regular streams, videos. And then yes, X, Twitter, whatever it's called now, Spirit of Ho, Spirit of Ho. That's where you can find me. And Telegram, you can find me. Just search my name, Danny Haifong, or China and Geopolitics, and find me there.
And you can find Yara on Twitter, now crying about her new president. Congratulations, Yara. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We have Hala on Wednesday, and we'll see you guys then. Take us out, Area.